But thank you so much for joining us today. It's really wonderful to have you here. My name is Rebecca Tapscott. I'm a lecturer in politics, and I research, among other things, research ethics and governance. And what we've been doing today is having a workshop kind of talking about those issues and how they pertain to the social sciences. And so when I started this project and joined York, I was really pleasantly surprised to discover that in 2004, a team of academics based at York Science and Technology Studies Unit, SATSU, held an ESRC grant actually to develop guidance on ethical review in the social sciences, right? So this is, for me, quite striking because, 20 years ago, at my very institution, sort of the heart of where some of this great work has been taking place. And they produced 4 papers, which can be accessed on their website still for anybody who wants to take a look. And these covered the gray area between social sciences and health-related research, the significance of international and non-UK guidelines for ethical review in the UK, as well as the conduct of social science research in developing countries. And finally, a paper recommending the adoption of ethical review committees to regulate research ethics in the social sciences in UK universities. And so today we have the wonderful and rare opportunity to have with us some of the investigators on that project, along with experts who can offer valuable perspectives from both policy and scholarship to reflect on how these issues have evolved over the past 2 decades and where we are today. So I'd now just briefly introduce the speakers and then hand it over to them. So we're joined by Nick Brown, who's a professor and head of department in sociology. And he served as a member and acting chair of the University of York's Faculty of Social Science Research Ethics Committee. He's also contributed to the guidelines that I just mentioned, especially working on the paper on developing the framework for social ethics and as well as in the developing countries paper, if I recall correctly. As part of the review, Nick led on that paper, and he undertakes ethically challenging externally funded social science research on immunity, vaccination, embryo experimentation, stem cell biology, tissue engineering, human and animal transplantation, blood donation, blood banking, and healthcare architecture, robotics, automation, and AI in medicine. All of that. So some tricky issues. We're also joined by Stephen Holland, who's a professor in the Department of Philosophy and Health Sciences, and he works on issues at the interface between these 2 disciplines, including bioethics and public health ethics. He has a lot of experience running research ethics committees, including in the Health Sciences Research Governance Committee, York's University Ethics Committee, now the AECC, the Public Health England, Research Ethics and Governance Committee. And research ethics has been a research theme for him since he participated in the ESRC 2004 funded project. And we're also joined by Jennifer Chubb, who's a lecturer in sociology at York, and her research sits in the fields of STS, science and technology studies, and focuses on epistemic responsibility, epistemic cultures, and the impact and perception of emerging technologies, in particular AI. Jen has held research roles focused on science policy and diplomacy, publishing on the relationship between research and researcher ethics in the and the societal impact of research, as well as being established in research policy and responsible research and innovation across a range of technologies and sectors. And we're also joined by Jo Duffy, who's joining us from the ESRC, where she's been since 2006. And she is currently based in the governance and policy team, leading on the ethics and research integrity, complaints, and peer review assessment policy. Before this, she worked in the ESRC's research directorate, leading on the ESRC's relationship with the former Department for International Development, and later as secretary to one of ESRC's standing grants assessment panels. Jo has a doctorate in South African history from the University of Oxford, which sounds like a fascinating project. And prior to joining ESRC, she worked at the British Empire and Commonwealth Museum in Bristol and at the University of Bristol, the West of England, and Sheffield in a variety of different roles. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'll pass it on to each of you to talk with us some about the 2004 project, what you see of it looking back today, where perhaps the field of ethics has come to. So we'll start with Nick, please.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks, Tom. I'd almost forgotten entirely about the research ethics framework documents and reports, but you haven't, no. Until Rebecca a few months ago, said, "Well, this be a nice opportunity to think back, what's about, the span of the last couple of decades or so." 20 years has passed really very quickly. A lot's happened indeed. Two of the lead authors are no longer actually with us, very sadly, and a third, Mary Bolton, has retired. Graham Lewis and Andrew Webster died. So I'm probably one of the last, alongside Steve, to kind of, take the credit or the rotten tomatoes, for some of this. The wider world looked really different back then. So Blair and Labour were in power. This was pre-crash, it was pre-austerity, pre-Arab Spring, it was pre-Syria, pre-Brexit. Nobody was really talking about a climate emergency back then. No chat GPT, no iPhones, and actually very few research ethics committees in the social sciences. So it was back in those kinds of days. So in rereading the review, I was quite interested in what the world looked like back then and how it kind of differs to where we are today. What concerned, I think, the ESRC at the time was all of the kind of governance activity going on elsewhere, the Department of Health, NHS, but also across the pond in the US and also in Australia and Canada, EU. So there was an element, I think, of keeping up with the neighbours back then. Department of Health had produced its 2003 Research Governance Framework document for clinical and social care research. There was a growing sense of anxiety, I think, about biomedical governance expanding beyond the protection of patients, receiving treatment into wider aspects of life and health service organisation, research on professional and managerial dimensions of health. Expanding from patients to personnel. So all of that was kind of going on, and also expanding into local council, social services, research. So the terms of the RGF, as it was cast back then, were extremely broad. The Social and Research Association had also voiced its concern in a 2003 report about medical recs threatening to over-regulate the social sciences. So the RGF, and the Research Governance Framework of the Department of Health, would make some aspects of research almost impossible to undertake, pricing out some categories of researchers and funders, and there were concerns about anti-innovative, risk-averse bureaucratization developing from what was happening in the regulation of health. So I think ESRC was very rattled at the time. There was a sense of, play the game or get played, get in charge of this somehow, do it or it'll be done to you. A social science research ethics framework would be about having a seat at the table or having a footprint in the kind of governance landscape, carving out its own rules rather than being subject to rules imposed from outside. So that's kind of where this was going on. Another driver was the internationalization of the funding environment, research ethics structures attached to Framework 6 at the EU level. Another driver was, I suppose, what we call now big data. Some of that included consumer behavior data, but also human genetic data, which was making big noise. This was an incredibly active time in the medical healthcare regulatory context of the establishment of the Human Genetics Commission and the UK Tissue Authority was going on. We also had the Data Protection Act back in 1998 and moves at the EU level that would eventually develop into GDPR. And then interdisciplinarity, the vision that we would all be teaming up in very different Frankensteinian combinations of disciplines, to collaborate on research. So all of that's what was going on. So we were charged in our brief, first of all, with scoping out the kind of ethics and governance landscape. And I think our mission was also to give voice to the many critical voices and ambivalence about the potentially counterproductive outcomes that might arise from a tick box, overly bureaucratic, procedurally unreflexive, formulaic framework that might overtake the social sciences. So I think rereading the 4 reports, I think it was quite an interesting reflection of a sort of painful and tortured attempt, in a sense, to strike a balance between those critical voices, those prophets of doom, and then what it was that, of course, the ESRC would be able to do in this landscape. So it was quite a difficult kind of narrow path to navigate. I was largely, as Rebecca says, tasked with leading on a paper concerned with social science, research ethics in resource-challenged country contexts, and all of the questions related to asymmetries of power and research questions around coloniality, ethical coloniality. But the last of the reports really does set out the organisational architecture of a research ethics framework. And what that might look like, and especially some of the pitfalls and the dangers that could be associated with, whichever avenue was chosen to go down in that space. And at the time when we were writing, of course, the landscape was largely populated by agreed codes of conduct, general professional body codes, but largely left to individual researchers. So this was a largely self-regulatory kind of environment, I think, is basically what was happening back then. This was quite in contrast, of course, to IRBs established in the US, but Canada, Australia, also elsewhere and developing elsewhere. So we were really keen to unpick the strengths and weaknesses of all of that kind of architecture. And we made, in the end, the case for largely kind of faculty level research ethics committees in the social sciences for approval processes, but also sites for sharing good practice, sources of advice. They would be disciplinarily representative. They would also probably have stakeholder lay membership too. But we entirely recognised that this would not be wholly welcomed, and were very articulate, I think, in why that might be the case, because of the threats to academic freedom, threats to perceptions of autonomy, the risk that social science, the risk to social science that would surpass the dangers to research participants, that the risks of participating in social science research are no greater than the risks encountered in everyday life, the risks that we must all accept as living in a kind of free society. So there were concerns that the Recs would be also imperially colonized by professionals, and especially bioethicists. I think there was a big concern about bioethicists. And that would reflect itself in a kind of there would be, I suppose, a purpose associated with Recs in terms of protecting institutional reputations, a preoccupation with legality and indemnity and data protection and health and safety. We also addressed the argument that Recs would represent the kind of medicalization of the social science research. Okay, so that was all fine. It's quite an interesting discussion, an interesting argument. And I think all of the kinds of clauses associated with what these LRECs would look like, and in a sense trying to navigate some of the kinds of hazards and dangers associated with that, but not necessarily dismissing them in principle, but actually addressing some of the kind of practical aspects of what this might look like. So that kind of brings my 5 minutes to a close. We can talk a little bit more about, our experience of how that translated into practice, which I think is a bit more of a bumpy road, and a journey that we're still on, I think. So anyway, that's my 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Steve, you want to get next?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, hello everybody. Thanks so much for the opportunity. Like Nick, I had to dredge up the report. So it was 20 years ago. Listen, the thing that I wanted to contribute really, there's two things. First of all, I can give you, as it were, an insider's view into how it is to run research ethics committees. And the reason I can do that is because I've run a ridiculous number of research ethics committees, right? I've run 3 research ethics committees: Health Sciences Research Ethics Committee, Research Governance Committee. I set up Public Health England's Ethics Committee, effectively. And I was also chair of the University Ethics Committee in the last 20 years. So I can give you a sort of insight into what it was like to actually run the kinds of committees that Nick's just introduced us to. So this network of research ethics committees, which is the main way in which we ensure that research is done in an ethical fashion, right? Now, one thing, I want to say 2 things. The first thing to say is that in many ways, the last 20 years have been an absolute nightmare for me personally, because pretty much everything that Nick's alluded to, all of the pitfalls, I mean, all of the worries have all come to pass. I mean, ethics committees, research ethics is an absolute nightmare. And I've run 3 of them is unbelievable to me. So it's kind of exhausting trying to make this thing work. So basically, the situation we've got is that we've got this network of research ethics committees, which is the main way in which we govern research and ensure that it's done ethically. But they're extremely difficult to do in ways that avoid things like over-bureaucratization, research, an adversarial relationship between the committee and the researchers, disallowing research that should go ahead, offering advice that research is done to, etc. It's just really difficult to run these committees in a way that it actually works, right? So it's kind of exhausting. So one thing that I wanted to introduce was a kind of broad question as to whether the system of RECs, research ethics committees, is actually the best way of ensuring that research is done in an ethically pristine fashion. I mean, it's questionable, right? It's questionable whether, but when you think about it, it's not obvious that was the way to go. So Nick alluded to the recommendation 20 years ago that we would do that. And then, to be honest, Nick, I thought I was recommending it for other people to run the committees, right? That was my idea. I did it, right? So, hoisted on my own baton. So one question is whether research ethics committees is the best way of ensuring it. And I can talk more if people are interested in the actual experience of trying to make this thing work. The second thing that I wanted to quickly allude to that I think is a really distinctive, important theme in the last 20 years is what I keep trying to get this phrase to catch on, which is regulation inflation, because it rhymes, right? Poetry of the highest order, but it's the rhymes, okay. And I keep wanting to get regulation inflation. I was really interested when I did what you did, Nick, to dig out the stuff from the past. The phrase ethical inflation is actually used by us in one of the things, right? Yeah. So we were concerned about ethical inflation. Now, this has really come, as far in my experience, has really come to pass, right? There's just more and more governance, there's more and more regulation in 2 directions, as it were. So one thing, the kind of traditional concerns that people have about research has become increasingly regulated. So I'll just give you one quick example. Take something like, say, informational privacy, where people are concerned about what happens to their data, right? So privacy concerns and data management concerns. That's always been an issue in research ethics. But then you fast forward to the GDPR, and it's like that becomes just more and more and harder to know how to, manage and process data. Right? So that's an example of kind of ethics inflation that kind of, as it were, goes down. But then there's also the other direction of it spreading wider as well. So again, can I just give you one very quick example? One of the things that we do with research is that we say, if it's research, then we're going to look at it really, really carefully. But if it takes place before the research, so this is things like, I don't know if people are familiar with public and patient involvement, where we involve the public in developing a study before it actually takes place. If it's what's known as PPI, which takes place before the research, we don't look at that. And if it's if it's an evaluation, right, evaluation of the research, we evaluated that we don't do that either, right? So, but what's happened is that now we're starting to look at those things because we're kind of thinking, well, that involves human participants as well, so we should protect them, and so we should, right? So we should be doing that. So there's more and more ethical scrutiny in both directions, drilling deeper into traditional ethical concerns and more kinds of activities. Right. So the two themes I wanted to put in people's heads are firstly a network of research ethics committees. A good idea, a good way. Is that a good way of governing research and ensuring that research is ethically pristine? That's one question. And the other thing is this creep or slippery slopes or whatever you want to call it of more and more inflation, more and more ethical scrutiny.
Regulation inflation.
Regulation inflation.
May I just ask, are you speaking about committees that exist in a university or in universities across the country? Because it's not clear to me which we're referring to.
Well, I was referring from my own experience to committees in this university, right. But it's everywhere. Right. I mean, this is how research is.
Every university has its own ethical research ethical committees.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they don't communicate with each other.
Well, can I just
one of these, and then we'll
Oh, is that okay? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So can I give you a very quick example of the kind of thing that's done my head in for the last 20 years? Right, is that if you get research studies where there's more than one principal investigator from more than one university, can you see what the problem is going to be? The problem is going to be that one researcher is going to say, I need to go through my university's ethics committee, and their colleague is going to say, well, I need to go through my research ethics committee, and then you only need to have 3 or 4 of those, and it's a nightmare because now the same study is going to 3 different ethics committees. Okay. So in a way, do they talk to each other? Well, in that sense, in the sense that, right. So what I insist on in my committee in health sciences is that if the study is going to go to a committee that's equivalent to ours here in York, then it doesn't have to go elsewhere. We don't do double or dual review, right? So an equivalent committee might say the University of Amsterdam might have an ethics committee, which is like the University of York. And if you've got researchers who are working together on a study that could go to both, it doesn't go to both, it just goes to one. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. But to answer your question, everywhere, ubiquitous.
And to contextualize, the reports that were written were giving recommendation to the UK largely. So that's kind of we're speaking as situated York academics about the broader UK.
Yeah.
With that, could I go to you, Jen?
Yeah, of course. Hi everyone, I'm Jen, and I wanted to talk to you about, sort of the bringing out a couple of the themes actually that have already been mentioned, but specifically thinking about the problems facing ethical review with respect to artificial intelligence and data science, which Steve just kind of hit upon one of the main things I wanted to get across, which is this demarcation between what we're seeing in ethics review of research and then ethics review of impact, of public engagement, public involvement. So I've been researching research, if you can do that, what we call meta science or meta research for about 13 years, looking at how the research practice is carried out, the culture that exists within it, things like impact, which we're expected to achieve within universities, and how the ethics of that sort of interacts with cultures and the academics within that space as well. Got a little bit heavy, all of that, so I moved into emerging technologies and started looking at artificial intelligence and the kind of governance of that. But inevitably, you end up back where you started with some of this stuff in STS. We start thinking about, the governance of emerging technologies, and in order to do that, we have to think about the research space as well. So I'm going to talk about 2 papers that relate to the ethical review of AI. One's written by myself and lead authored by Gabrielle Samuel, who's at King's College London, and Gemma Derrick, who's now at Bristol. And that paper's on boundaries between research ethics and the ethical use of research. Okay, now that isn't AI health research, but I want to stress that even though we're talking about social sciences, AI is pretty interdisciplinary. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the findings that came out of that paper briefly, and then just to relate some of the issues that have come out of a recent report from Ada Lovelace as well. So the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is set up as a research institute, looked at ethical review practices within AI and data science as well. Broadly, both really outline the necessity for research to be conducted safely, of course, responsibly, but to understand this link between the broader societal impacts and crucially not to divorce the two when we're thinking about research ethics committees. And they're both emphasising the need really for the evolving ethical review process, okay, so that it can address these unique challenges, as Nick says, that we weren't needing to think about 20 years ago. About data science research, how we prevent harm and foster trust in artificial intelligence, for instance. But that needs to underscore the importance of how we think about responsibility in those contexts and the broader implications on society of AI. And in order to do so, both papers were really sort of saying, you know, we really need to shake this up a little bit. So let's just think back a bit more of the background. So we know, as Nick said, the governance of research ethics in HE has been scrutinised for decades, primarily preventing the misuse of human participants. But recently there's been more growth in an area called responsible research and innovation, which is kind of where my research sits. At the same time, then you've got this kind of parallel growth going on in AI. We know that in AI and data research, there's at least up to 4% of all papers are on this now, on AI and data science. But they pose unique ethical challenges that, quite frankly, not a lot of people have the expertise to assess at review level. Not least because those of us who are working in AI, who are working at the crossroads of the interdisciplinary nature of it, not just machine learning technical staff, but also social scientists, philosophers, etc. Not least because we're still understanding it as it's moving forward as well. So if we're still trying to unpack issues of consent, privacy, data bias, transparency, and responsible use of AI technologies in the everyday, in the moment, how do we get those who are coming to research ethics committees as non-experts or related experts to grasp some of those issues, which are very crucially important for us to address and keep safe society in this age of AI. What both reports kind of reveal then is a kind of ethical debt, really, which is kind of coming forth. So that's inadequately reviewed AI research then leads to this, because we don't address assumptions correctly, or we don't necessarily understand the trust issues that are revealed in some of these mechanisms. So both reports are kind of calling for enhanced review mechanisms, okay, which I think I'll be happy to talk about. They both note that there's a lack of resources around some of this, lack of expertise, as I mentioned, and a mismatch with traditional ethics principles. So they're not entirely suitable for AI research and data science research. I'm happy to talk about any of those aspects if anyone has any questions. What's happening at the same time is a kind of emergence of AI-specific principles that are coming out, but they're not necessarily consistently adopted by recs. And then there are issues with governance and consistency there as well. So the involvement of multiple institutions in AI research can then complicate ethical reviews further. We've noted lack of standards and regulation, all those kinds of issues going on. Difficulty in predicting harms with something like AI remains an issue. And then, as I say, this separation of ethical responsibilities to the public and to our participants and doing the research itself. We like to recommend that they include broader impact statements, encouraging researchers to consider these impacts, possibly adopting a multi-stage ethical review, or maybe interdisciplinary and experiential expertise in recs as a minimum. Ultimately, this is a moving feat, really. In terms of enhancing our ethical review mechanisms, we're really looking to try and bring in those societal impacts of research and calling for shared ethical responsibilities across the decision-making process. So in our paper, we talk about the ecosystem, the ethics ecosystem. So it's not just about the researchers doing the research, it's the publics that are involved, it's the policymakers, it's the funders. This was all kind of getting ahead and thinking about how we think about it as a justice issue, really, and we reduce inequalities in the way in which we conduct AI and data science research. So I hope that gives you a flavour of some of the things I'm thinking about at the moment.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. And now we'll go to Jill.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. So I'm going to use my 5 minutes, having not been involved in this work 20 years ago, having not even been at ESRC 20 years ago, although 17, to sort of give you a brief overview of the funder's perspective and kind of outline our current approach and how we arrived at it. Really, what happened next? 2004, this work happened here, but what then happened next? So since 2004, the Framework for Research Ethics, we changed the name to disambiguate with the REF. It was the REF. We had the REF first, and then they made the REF, then we had to rename that. So the Framework for Research Ethics has kind of undergone a series of light touch reviews, more thorough reviews, some of them in consultation with the research community and with expert advisors, some of them kind of in-house. It's fair to say that it's probably due, even overdue, another update. But since the founding of UKRI 6 years ago, and I can't quite believe it's 6 years since UKRI was founded, we've kind of switched our focus to working across towards a sort of harmonised cross-UKRI, pan-UKRI position on research ethics, in common with all of the work that we're doing around harmonisation between the 7 research councils, Innovate and Research England. But there are 2 elements, I think, that are kind of common to both ESRC's Framework for Research Ethics and UKRI's kind of emerging approach. And that's a set of requirements or musts that include our terms and conditions of funding and the UKRI policy on the governance of good research practice, which is a bit of a mouthful, and then a range of principles and guidance and sort of shoulds, which include things like the ESRC Framework for Research Ethics, the UKRI position statement on funding ethical research, and the UKRI Good Research Resource Hub, which I would encourage you to seek out if you haven't seen. So our terms and conditions require that researchers consider ethical issues and that they raise them with what we call the relevant regulatory or approval body, and that research that requires approval, so that's any research involving human beings, doesn't start until that approval has been secured. And then the good research practice policy kind of goes a step further and gives a little bit more detail. It makes it clear that UKRI doesn't actually grant ethical clearance as part of our funding processes. We might recommend a grant for funding, but we're not saying it's ethical. We don't have time to go through that sort of process as part of our commissioning process. So we devolve that piece of work out to the universities, out to the recs that were formed on the recommendation of the York Group back in 2004. And we also set out a series of expectations, what we expect a research ethics committee to look like within a university, what we expect a university to put out by way of training and the sort of support that they should be offering their staff. ESRC's Framework for Research Ethics is based around 6 core principles, and they've remained pretty consistent over the past couple of decades. So these are that research should aim to maximise benefit for individuals and society and minimise risk and harm. The rights and dignity of individuals and groups should be respected. That wherever possible, participation should be voluntary and appropriately informed. That research should be conducted with integrity and transparency. That lines of responsibility and accountability should be clearly defined. And lastly, that independence of research should be maintained, and that where there are conflicts of interest that can't be avoided, that they should be made explicit, so that there's a sort of transparency piece there. And we also expect that our researchers, research organisations and recs consider ethics throughout the life cycle of research. So ethical scrutiny is not once and done. You don't do it at the start, tick it off, and then kind of, put that behind you in the rearview mirror and off you go. But rather that it should be ongoing through the planning stage, through the period of funding for the project and beyond the period of funding, so that once you're sort of into the territory of knowledge exchange and impact activities and archiving data for future research, the ethics should still be kind of stamped through all of those activities like a stick of rock. But since 2022, things have sort of been moving, and now we're in the brave new world of UKRI. And we've been trying to kind of create that cross-UKRI harmonised position on ethics and responsible innovation. And this is something that can be seen in a position statement that we published on ethical research and innovation, which was published in 2022 and outlines a set of high-level ethical principles that all 9 organisations, all constituent organisations of UKRI could agree upon. And it's sort of designed to create a kind of very clear scaffolding, architecture for our stakeholders so that there's one place to go and you can see what it is that we're looking for. So it's a consistent approach with the pre-existing guidance. We kind of cobbled it together from what ESRC was doing, what MRC was doing, what NERC was doing in terms of sort of environmental regulation, what STFC and EPSRC were doing in terms of responsible research and innovation. So it doesn't kind of supersede those frameworks that have already been laid out by the councils, but it does pull them together into one document. And we recognise that necessarily there will be disciplinary differences in how those high-level principles are applied. Gratifyingly for ESRC, the position statement outlines 11 shared high-level principles, including the 6 that I've already told you about, so the ESRC ones. But then it's extended to include a set of principles which relate to transparent and respectful partnerships, the consideration of equality, diversity and inclusion, the use of animals in research only when non-animal alternatives aren't available, minimising environmental impacts, negative environmental impacts, and that the outputs of publicly funded research should be freely accessible as soon as possible and in conditions that maximise reuse to amplify social, economic, environmental and research benefits. So with all of that in mind, since 2020, we've been developing something called the Good Research Resource Hub, which brings together our policies, our standards and our guidance relating to ethics, relating to research integrity, relating to research culture. And the resources on that site are curated by a small group of subject matter experts from across UKRI. So they're drawn from all different constituent councils. And we review annually the content of the hub, make sure it's up to date, make sure it's consistent with guidance and legislation and all of those good things. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of what we've been doing. And I think just to summarise, our approach can maybe best be summarised as having the following key characteristics, which link back to the work that the York Group did in 2004. So our approach to ethics is not prescriptive and it's not one size fits all. We've sought to lay out an enabling framework which encourages people to be self-reflective and identifies what the key ethical considerations are that we would expect to see when people are talking about that in their applications to us. We expect that researchers will apply those principles in their specific context and that they will argue the case for the approach that they're taking to the REC that they're taking their work to for approval. We expect that people abide by national legal and regulatory frameworks, of course, and international standards where relevant. But we recognise that there are disciplinary differences. We recognise that there are debates within the academic community about what ethical research looks like. So we're not trying to put people in a straitjacket, very much the alternative. We're not seeking to sort of set out a set of overriding principles which kind of push everybody else out of the way. So what we're looking at is being consistent with and kind of in dialogue with the information that's given out, for instance, by learned societies or by other funders or by international colleagues and other jurisdictions. We're very clear that ethical research is a kind of constant iterative process, and that going back throughout the research life cycle and having conversations with the REC is an important sort of side of that. We do consider ethical issues in peer review and research assessment, but as I've said, we don't grant ethical clearance. What we do is really to set the framework. So our role is to kind of set out the expectations and to play an assurance role, but then the actual work of doing it, scrutiny, gets kind of handed out to the research organisations. So that's a kind of how we got to where we are now and where we started in 2004.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So that was, I think, brilliant. Linking together quite a bit of different perspectives on the past 20 years. Maybe we'll open the floor to questions now, and if we could maybe collect a few and then hand back to the panel or comments. And there's quite a few people here with experience on ethics committees or engaged in ethics practices as well. So whether comments or questions, if there are some interjections, we welcome them. Yes.
This is a question, I promise. You've mentioned the broadening of the ethics scope and things like that, and I wondered to what extent you've seen a change in thinking about ethics or risk rather for the researcher themselves. So I feel like that's something we talk about quite a lot in my department. And I just wondered if you'd seen that change.
I think probably it has changed over time. I mean, I've spent 5 years as a panel secretary to one of the ESRC's commission panels. So every application that comes in has an ethics statement. The question used to say, do you have any ethical issues? And you could actually say no, which was insane because everybody has ethical issues. But the statements of, what are your ethical issues and how you get them? And I think certainly we've seen, as times evolved, we've seen more about safeguarding of researchers, more about, thinking about not just, the research participants, but also the research team. And, those things to influence to yourself at the same point.
Yeah, I'd add that, I'm a reviewer for the Wellcome Trust's social science early career grants. And yeah, you're right, we're always there looking to scrutinise that, and often, somebody will be saying they're going to go and do fieldwork somewhere, and it's really, really not safe for them personally or physically. And so I think those conversations are being had a lot more. One thing I wanted to just raise was just around the impact point again. The safety of the researcher to engage the public is not often talked about. If you're working in controversial areas and things like that, we have colleagues in this university who might work on eye movement and or memory and might use animals for whatever reason. They will have obviously gone through ethics, but they then are expected through the REF and other mechanisms to go and engage the public as part of their contractual arrangements. But actually, they might actually be abused by the public if they're using animals. Even if they're doing it ethically, there's still that mismatch. Colleagues, who anecdotally would say to one another, I'm working on some controversial like euthanasia or assisted dying. I don't want to go and give this talk to the public. Some will still go out and do it though, because they want to make that case. And then their safety in that context is also something to be considered. So yeah, I'm really advocating today, I'm ending up advocating today, really around this impact angle to both include it in terms of the research ethics of it for those participants and keeping them safe, but also for the researcher themselves, especially if they're working in controversial areas. Yeah.
I have a question. Okay, I'll ask a question. Paul, you go first, and then I'll go second, and then you guys can.
Sure, okay. Thanks to all the presenters. I really enjoyed the presentations. I guess my question is a simple one, really, which is what would the alternative look like? Stephen, you said you didn't think it was inevitable that we ended up with ethics committees and the kind of over-direction that I think we probably all agree we have. But do you know of examples of universities or faculties that have, no?
No, honestly. Right. I mean, it's such a good question, Bob, because this is we've been talking about this all day, right? And the predicament that I think we're in is that the least worst option is a system of research ethics committees. I think that's the least worst option. And we were talking about even walking over. I was asking you if did you have any ideas what might be an alternative, and we agreed that's what work in progress and well. So the way that I solve my conscience in terms of doing all this committee work, committing myself to something which I'm not entirely sure is by saying we've got to have them, so let's try and make them as reasonable and as sensible and as judicious as possible. Now, I'm not saying I achieve that, right? That's for other people to say for. But if it were the case, that would be great. But that's not for me to say. But I think the predicament we're in. It's the least worst option. They've got loads of problems with them. We've been talking all day about all the problems with ethics committees, but I don't know what the alternative is.
I think one of the things that we were really at pains to emphasise in our paper 4, which was kind of what this architecture might look like, and we went through a big long list of what the alternatives are, and we kind of one by one dismissed them and arrived inevitably at this thing, which was roughly faculty level, LREC type things. But we spent an awful lot of time talking about expedition, how fast can these things move, to actually, in light touch, governance terms. Not everything needs to be looked at in the same way. So a triage process, and we spent a lot of time unpacking how expedition and triage could work. And my understanding, my thinking is none of that's been adopted. Everything is subjected to the same level of scrutiny without actually a way out, an earlier way out for something to come off the kind of merry-go-round, that these things get caught in. And the other aspect, I think, also, which I was quite surprised about rereading. I don't know whether you clocked this, but actually we spent an awful lot of time talking about the need for workloading resourcing and training. And a key component and element of that training would being able to exercise that level of judgment about what it is that doesn't need to be looked at. It just doesn't need this level of attention. Some things do, some things don't, but it takes training and resource to be able to determine the difference. Otherwise you end up with a one size fits all equal, application of the heavy, mallet,
And that's, we still have those things that you recommended in our guidance, expedited, light touch, proportionate, ethics committee work. But it's become very clear to me today, it's good for me to get out of the office, clearly. It's become clear to me today that actually there's a real risk averse nature to ethics committees, and that there is the element of protecting the university, protecting the reputation, not doing anything dicey, which, ESRC is looking for risky research. We want it to be ethically, pursued, but actually we do have an appetite for risk. And that's not maybe translating. I think the research ethics committees are being quite prudent or quite kind of doctrinaire in the way that they're actually interpreting our guidance is more flexible, but they're actually a little bit risk averse, a little bit nervous, and therefore they're kind of sometimes taking the kind of sledgehammer to crack a nut approach. So yes, I'm learning things, and I will take them back and think of them, because they say I've got the answers.
I just wanted to make a brief interjection on this, because we started this morning by saying what's necessary to ethics committees. And we talked about a lot of things, but something that nobody said was that it should be a committee. Nobody also said that it should be at a university. So I was struck that was the comment just now.
It's the least worse.
Yeah, I mean, I would posit that actually we haven't done enough unpacking of what other options would look like, in particular around the incentives that exist. So it makes sense in the current political economy of knowledge production that we're in the UK, that the donor can set out, do risky research that is ethical, and that the university, in implementing that, gravitates toward risk aversion. And we should be able to assess that by thinking about the incentives that these different institutions have, and that might shape the evaluation of the different options. And so we could say it's necessary, and we're going to have some kind of ethical review or ethical standards. But I wonder if that should be disentangled from the question of the current formulation that we have.
No, I'm just thinking really, obviously working in the AI field, the AI ethics field, I'm just very aware that all I'm always seeing is, there's a lack of literacy around that particular area, or a lack of expertise really. And so, yes, we could do just what you're saying. And I think that's a massive part of it. But to me, it's still about possibly people being risk averse because they're not sure, particularly in the space of AI and data science, for example. Sometimes maybe it's just that I don't want that responsibility, so we will push it back. We will keep pushing against it. So I do wonder as well, as Nick was saying, I think in that 20-year paper training, or just at least that literacy element really needs to be there for people to really understand what it is that they are assessing. I don't know. I mean, I know that the funders do this and we work to do that, but with something like AI, it's a moving feed. So you're trying to train somebody to understand the implications of ChatGPT. Well, good luck. We're all trying to do that. So it's difficult with something like that that's very new and very, very risky. So, yeah.
So I was just going to say something that has come up repeatedly today is that there's a kind of entanglement between the kind of ethics bit and the regulatory bit. So there's the tick box, are you meeting all of the requirements, the legalities? And then there's often that's where the ethics committees gravitate, because that's where the risk is to some degree. And then there's not space left for the kind of conversation about ethics. What do we really mean by ethics? And the kind of iterative, nature of this, that, you don't just do it, skip off into the sunset, having got your sign off, but you may well have to come back and have, issues will emerge throughout the research. So I think that's been a kind of interesting dimension to the discussions today. The other thing I just wanted to raise, I haven't mentioned it before, but I think it's probably pertinent to all of this, is that the question that I get asked most as the kind of owner of the ESRC's ethics mailbox, and in fact UKRI's ethics mailbox, is I don't work at a university. I don't have access to a REC. Who's going to look at the ethics of my work? And actually that's the part of the system, as we're trying to kind of expand the people who are getting involved in the scientific enterprise within the UK, and offline laser, our executive, our CEO is very passionate about science being for everyone. What about the people who aren't in universities? Where do they go to get the ethical scrutiny? It's great if you've got an academic partner, because you can ask their ethics committee to look at it. But if you haven't got an ethics committee, if you're a part of a small NGO or a small research active organisation, where do you go? And I literally don't have the answer to that one.
Yeah, we have a system for academic.
We do.
Research for academics. We have a few questions. I'm going to collect, there's at least 3, so we'll collect 3 of them and then give each of you a chance to respond. And then we're amazingly probably at time. So would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. That was a great reflection to the end, and something that I've thought about as well. I think having worked in the international development field in research roles where you just see research being done and sort of who is ethically thinking about how these pieces of research are being done. And they're being done by development organizations, as we call them as well, so not necessarily universities. But I wanted to come back to the question about sort of the relevance, or I suppose the worth of the REC. So I'm part of the ethics committee in my department, and I wasn't trained to be on the department, so I think that's probably a fairly quick fix, like actually just training or orientation of people that we are co-opting into this committee. But part of, I suppose, my relevance is because I've done some work around ethics. But I really like your point around the conversation that we need to have. And we don't do that, actually. The conversation is through sort of providing comments on the applications that we receive. And I do try to make it a bit more conversational and not just having sort of bite-sized comments, but actually asking questions that I think will enable people to think ethically. But the question I have is, there is a lot of emphasis on anonymity. And I wonder the extent to which we require anonymity, because we can't have a conversation if we're anonymous. So I'm reviewing an application form as an anonymous reviewer. The person, maybe if they know how I write, might be able to guess who I am, but they don't know who I am. I know who they are. But I think that anonymity is a hindrance to having a conversation. And for me, the conversation about ethics is what is important. It's not just sort of tick box regulatory element. It's having those conversations about sort of those ethical moments, what we might be able to do to address or respond to those ethical moments that you encounter in research. So just a question about anonymity and what we can do about that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Ruth.
Followed on really beautifully, I think. So I was just thinking about alternatives and thinking about 2 examples that I've come across recently where we have had like deeply challenging and interesting conversations, and it's both really with external partners who felt quite confident in engaging back with us and pushing back. So one is a piece of work that we're doing with some activists in Mexico who have worked in like the area they've been working in for many, many years. But another is Mary Lang's work, co-constructed with sex workers who she's been working with for 20 years, right? And so like those spaces are spaces for really deeply challenging and interesting ethical conversations that will carry on through the project because those people are involved in the project. And it made me think about that. So I guess if there is a question, I'd be really interested, Joe, like this idea of partnerships that has come through, is that the kind of thing that you're imagining, or is it completely different?
No.
Sorry, Ellen.
We're gonna do one more comment, last one, Sanjeev. do you have something?
I actually wanted to just respond to Joe's question about IRBs and what to do if you're independent, you have a little storefront and you're doing research, right? And you don't have an institution. Well, in the US, there's something known as commercial IRBs or unaffiliated IRBs. Don't wish for one because they've been taken over by venture capitalists, and venture capitalists and ethics, I don't, in my humble opinion, go together. So, but that's an alternative in the US.
Okay, so maybe we'll let each of you, give a response to them. Yeah, please.
So I forgot the first one.
The first one was about anonymity and
Anonymity,
giving
yeah.
comments.
Can
as
I
a
make just make one very quick comment about that? So why, so is the thought that the committee members are anonymous to the researcher?
Yes.
Is that right? But I mean, in my view, if that's a problem, then something's gone wrong in the relationship between the committee and the researcher, because the communication should be much better than that, and the chair isn't anonymous, right? And right, and contact with the chair should be really easy, and then it should be then possible for the chair to then involve, for example, if it was a piece of research on AI or some other specific, and then there's a member of the committee who's on the committee because they have expertise in that area, so the chair then gets that committee member together with the researcher and they meet. I mean, it shouldn't be that difficult for there to be communication.
But I guess my question is around whether anonymity is required in the process. It's built in as part of the process as it is at the moment. Although the chair does allocate the applications to who they think is relevant.
Well, I mean, I'm a cooler go from my own experience, but the biographies of all the committee members are public.
Yeah, but you
There's
don't know
no
who they
reason.
send to.
There's no reason that it has to be
Yeah.
anonymous.
No,
There's no
that's it.
guideline that says that. It's an internal practice. And there may be committees at universities in the UK that don't do it that way. And there certainly are committees in the world that don't do it that way.
But I think your point's really, hit the nail on the head in some ways, because there's this kind of going into the ethics process as an applicant, you're entering into a really uncertain world, aren't you? Where there's huge asymmetries of power. You've had to kind of produce this, case that you think is going to be scrutinised by who knows, and you put it into this bureaucratic machine, and it's already a kind of adversarial kind of relationship, isn't it? I mean, obviously, as you say, a good chair will actually say, well, don't worry, why don't you just talk directly to the reviewer? The reviewer can be involved in that conversation. But there is that process. And if we can somehow, right from the very start, actually overcome some of those barriers so that you actually do feel as though you're entering not into an adversarial relationship, but into one which is a supportive conversation about just, and that you are supported and they're on your side. Whereas lots of applicants don't feel as though ethics committees are on their side. They think they're there to kind of derail things for them.
I mean, a lot of that's tied up in how people perceive ethics, isn't it? That it's a roadblock.
Yeah.
Comes back to stuff. Yeah, that and I think if we were able to, it's just got such a bad name for itself, which is a shame. But even in student teaching, you'll turn up and say, "I want to talk about ethics," and I just think. And the same in industry as well. You're going to stop my innovation. You're going to stop my ideas. You're going to slow me down. So some way in which we can, as you say, kind of improve that conversation so that ethics is a supportive thing. And this isn't to stop you doing what you're doing unless it's really bad. But this is to support you doing it better and responsibly, so it's fair for everybody. Yeah, and perhaps those messages around it need shaking up a bit.
Does that help? Does that help at all with him?
A bit. I mean, I've been involved in a few ethics committees, so they've all been anonymized from the reviewers' point of view. So I thought it was standard practice, if you will. So I'm just sort of questioning that practice. So if it's different in your department, that'd be quite interesting.
No, it may be very standard practice. I think it's quite common. Again, linking to this idea of how ethics committees work and kind of a lot of times there's concern about, and now I'm speaking from my experience researching ethics committees, a lot of times there's concern that the authority of the committee members won't be appreciated, partly because we're no more trained than the people who we're reviewing. And so there's an effort often to create distance there. Also oftentimes under the mantle of like not wanting to have conflicts of interest, and there's all sorts of justifications for it. But there's no regulatory reason that it has to be that way, or even design feature that says that it has to be that way. Yeah.
No, it's certainly not something that ESRC has in our kind of research ethics framework. It's, you know, it's not an expectation at all. And I would say, you know, from the funders' perspective, what we're certainly not trying to make things worse for people. You know, we're trying to create a framework that's enabling and that will enhance people's ability to do their research in ways that are both ethical and have integrity. You know, that's got to be a positive thing. And so I think if we can kind of flip that relationship so that it doesn't seem adversarial, so that it does seem like a dialogue, like a conversation, something that, you know, an issue arises during the course of somebody's research, that they don't think, oh God, damn, I've got to go back to the ethics committee. But they think, I'm going to go and talk to the ethics committee because they're going to be able to help me. They're going to have ideas. That's a much more positive way of framing things. So that's, you know, that's how we hope for things to be. On the partnerships issue, it very much came out of, I think, our sort of work in international development research. So, you know, partnerships of mutual benefit for colleagues in the global south, that we're not just extracting information and then going away and publishing our lovely papers and kind of leaving behind, you know, the people who are actually on the ground and you know, they're not just data collection people. So, you know, that's kind of where we started that, and that has actually really infected everything that UKRI does now. So in a good way, infected in a good way. So, you know, when we're thinking about community engagement, when we're thinking about patient participation, when we're thinking about all of those things working in the UK, that, you know, when we're working with, you know, no research about us without us, it's that kind of approach. And I think that is a big change from when I started at ESRC 17 years ago. I think there's a lot more about making sure that those kind of potential asymmetries in power and those potential sort of feelings of, oh, we're being a bit extractive here, that there's support for not doing that and for thinking about things in a different way. So that's kind of where it came from.
So I'm going to have to at least make one more interjection, because it's the hill that I will die on, which is just this dissonance, right? So we've spent all day talking about challenges with ethics committees. I've been making a bid that there's something about both the committee form and the principles that we implement in the way that we do that makes them fundamentally work the way that we've kind of been critiquing here. And I can tell you from my research that both over decades and globally, these are the same kinds of problems that are encountered, which makes me have to say that this idea of if only we could make some changes so that people were happy to go back to ethics committees, or we could just help people a bit more, that is, we may have some successes with very dedicated individuals, with some good reforms in time, but the gravity, the center of gravity that we've seen over and over again is moving back toward a bureaucratic process. And so my proposal is either to try to do something to change the way that we do it, or to accept that as what this system of ethical review is. It might achieve some other things like compliance with rules that we care about, but to kind of accept that that's the beast we're dealing with, and to work, if we're going to work with it, work within it in that sense, instead of wishing it to do something that we've never seen it do in a sustainable way. So I hate to, that seems like a negative note to end on. If anybody has a final interjection, please. Sorry, there's drinks.
We can come back in another 20 years, see how far that's got.
Well, we don't have any movement yet, but we're working on it.
It feels like that a lot of this is reminiscent of other kind of processes in higher education, though. You know, take something like the rep or something like that. You know, ultimately, you know, there's been so many reviews of that, and I was involved in a review of that. And, you know, there's loads of funders and researchers trying to grapple with some of these agendas that are emerging in higher education, and ultimately the kind of conversation that keeps coming back to is it's the least worst thing.
Yeah.
What Steve keeps saying, because you've got to think, well, what else could get brought in? And I suppose, yeah, again, maybe for now that is kind of where we are, but yeah, certainly it sounds like there's a lot of things that have been discussed that may be able to make it even least.
Yeah, I think the question is, how can we work in the constraints that exist in a realistic way instead of wishing for a system that, instead of wishing a system, you know, instead of wishing a hammer to fly a plane or something, right? Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.